afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on basic sociology, in today's lecture we are going to discuss on the relation between cinema, race and gender inequality. The basic question is that when we watch movies or cinemas, does we do it only for entertainment, or does it structure the way we kind of connect to other people, the way we kind of structure our social relationship in everyday life? And is cinema kind of reproducing what is the reality in society, or it also leads to the construction of new sets of inequality? Through this lecture, we will understand how cinema, basically in the Western context, so today's lecture we are going to focus on Hollywood and how Hollywood cinema has led to the production, reproduction and re-strengthening of two kinds of social inequality. One is the racial inequality and second the gender inequality. So this lecture is specifically referring to the Hollywood cinema, but we will see a parallel to what's happening in other forms of cinema. More or less, they are all kind of re-strengthening biases, stereotypes around certain marginal groups, may around the untouchable, or around the blacks, or around women, and by kind of legitimizing these ideas, notions of inequality gets further strengthened in the society. So let's begin. Classic Hollywood cinema portrays ethnic and minority groups. The minority groups are Indian, Black, Hispanic and Jewish as stereotypes. Women, irrespective of class, depicted through the male gaze as desired object, categorized as good or bad women, good or bad mothers, sinners or saint. So this binary between the good and the bad is maintained. So there are certain structural mindset or stereotype which are kind of running parallelly to what defines a good mother or what defines as a good woman, and anyone who is moving away from those described prescriptive norms and behaviors are then categorized as a bad woman or a sinner or a bad mother. And this we see through most of the Bollywood and Hollywood movies that are part of our everyday life. Cinema does not represent women. So they are not actually telling us what a man or a woman is. They are kind of leading to the creation of certain masculinity and feminine identity. Cinema creates and reshapes racial and gendered experiences, reinforcing social orders of inequality, masculinity and violence. So it's kind of portraying, when we see a cinema, and it's kind of portraying the man as a brave, as a person who cannot cry, as a person who cannot suffer from pain. What is the cinema doing? They are telling us certain kind of ideas about masculinity, that who is a masculine man? A man who is brave, who can kind of fight, who can take on all kinds of pain and will not cry even if there is a pain. So it is re-strengthening stereotypes around certain biological body framed into the identity of a man and a woman. So Hollywood history, if we look into it, we see that for over the years, over a century of years, inequality and political economy has been a part of the cultural studies. There are a lot of literature which has kind of turned the focus towards the construction of inequality in cultural studies, and Hollywood history of selling inequality. So we will kind of make the reference of understanding inequality and cinematic representation in the contemporary context of neoliberal economy or a neoliberal society where the market is the dominant thing. So everything is got commoditized, everything is being sold and purchased, and therefore we kind of not look into cinema only as something which is done for the purpose of entertainment or something that we see and get happy and excited, but there is a kind of an economy, political economy behind the construction of this cinema and the cinematic industry or the Hollywood history, and that is they are selling a product. The product is the cinema. Now they are going to sell a product which is going to have a higher purchasing power, and therefore in this neoliberal economic space we see the inequality is embedded. It is continuously being reinforced through the ideas of racial and gender inequalities. So neoliberalism basically fuels a culture of fear, war against dark-skinned terrorists, and rising crony capitalism. So those who are on the other side, those who are on the subordinate side, are labeled as certain kind of criminals or individuals with kind of non-social behavior. So if you are a black, you can be a kind of labeled as a terrorist, or if you are from a minority religion, you can be considered as a criminal, and this has been portrayed as part of the cinema, which is kind of part of everyone's everyday life. And therefore, when we see that these ideas about masculinity, violence, class oppression, racial oppression and social justice are widespread with affirmative action under attack. Calls for performative cultural studies to disrupt dominant cultural practices and foster a more democratic society. And here when we try to understand these discourse or the mainstream argument around theorizing cinematic representation and the way it produces inequality, we make reference to two kind of school of thought. One is the classical theory, which is mostly dependent on the Marxist materialistic understanding, and the other is the leftist critique of the classical economic theory. So the leftist critique argue class should be prioritized over identity, politics like gender, race and sexuality. So the whole idea is that we cannot kind of consider class as a permanent, because class identity is surfaced or intersects with other identity like gender, race and sexuality. The leftist critique fear that cultural studies contribute to the fragmentation of the left into identity-based movement. So the cultural studies critique argue that class identity is fluid and shaped by race, gender and historical mediations. The leftist critique, on the other hand, aligned with right-wing attacks on minorities, blaming identity politics for the white class. So we have two argument kind of opposing each other. On one side, we have the cultural study, which is kind of arguing that class identity is fluid and it is shaped by race and gender. Whereas the leftist critique, they kind of look into the materialist idea, and they are kind of talking about the movements which are identity based and kind of move away from the class based analysis and look into the way in which identity politics functions. So when we look into the idea of class in terms of the cultural study, it becomes invisible, and class exists but it remains hidden in the American discourse spoken through race, ethnicity and gender. So much of the discourse around social inequality in the Western context, specifically in America, are centered around identity politics, identity of which race you belong to, with ethnic background, with gender, and in that situation the class takes a backseat. It becomes an invisible criteria. Class identity is deeply connected with race and gender and is displaced by other social differences. So the neoliberalism and global agreements, which is kind of like the NAFTA, fuel global exploitation by blending race, class and gender. Class, though hidden, continues to shape inequality through intersection with race and gender in the context of neoliberalism. So the idea is of the intersectionality and the whole idea that we cannot understand inequality as long as we focus on only the class or we focus only on gender. The intersectionality becomes very significant because they cut across. The class, gender, race are all kind of enmeshed together to determine the identity of an individual, and also the treatment of exploitation or marginality is faced around the intersectionality of gender, race, class, ethnicity. So, that is the importance that we cannot kind of argue only for understanding inequality from one dimension. Rather, inequality or inequalities are now multidimensional, and we need to understand it from all the dimensions. So, when we look into the cinema, or we kind of move back to Hollywood films, we need to re-examine these movies, and we need kind of reading race cinematically, and that is how do we kind of read these the text of these cinemas in terms of ideological construct, and they are kind of having various versions of race, gender and class inequality. Race films represent version of American racial system shaped by theories on race. So, in social sciences, we have a whole amount of theories kind of talking about the marginality of the black by the white, and lot of theories of race which has been picked up by the creators of these cinemas and used to kind of reproduce the ideas of racial inequality. So, films especially from the 1990s reflect a post-civil rights racial politics connecting race and class to a culture of violence. Films don't mirror reality, they create a racialized and a gendered social order. Critical cultural studies engage with films to reveal how they shape the audience understanding of racial inequality. So, as it is, there is a lot of cultural study, media studies which has become predominant in the neoliberal times, and the idea behind these critical studies is to kind of re-examine the text of the movies to understand whether they are just representing reality or they are kind of reproducing the reality and further leading to the legitimization of inequality and violence. So, here the focus is to understand America's cinematic racial order, and if we look into the Hollywood racial order, it is gendered, racialized and class. And if you see the intersection of gender, race and class together kind of reinforces social inequality, and the major argument is that neoliberal societies are far more unequal than it could be say prior to the commoditization of all the commodities around in terms of even the identity has got commoditized. So, racial stereotypes from 1900 to 2000, that is black, Asian, Hispanics, Native American, are shaped by race theories like eugenics, segregation and multiculturalism. So, these are different ways of which how we understand the everyday connection, interaction between the people from multiple identities. Some of the theories of eugenics, segregation and multiculturalism are applied. Cinematic depiction of racial violence, gangs and drunks in the 1980s and 90s reinforce racialized violence. So, the idea is that when you are seeing it on the movie or on the cinema on the white screen, you kind of consider it as a part of everyday life, and you then kind of takes it as natural and you repeat the same act, and that is how it gets widened and further accepted by the wider society. So, the Hollywood racial order reflects and perpetuates social hierarchies, constructing a racialized national imagination. So, we will make reference to one of the movie, a very brief reference to one of the movie which kind of tells us how the cinema or the Hollywood cinema reproduces racial inequality. Do the Right Thing is a 1989 American comedy, a drama film produced, written and directed by Spike Lee, an American film director, producer, screenwriter, actor and author. His work has continuously explored race relations, issue within the black community, the role of media in contemporary life, urban crime and poverty, and many other political issues. So, Spike Lee's movie has been taken up as a point of reference and try to understand how race inequality is part of the Hollywood cinema. Look into the story of the Do the Right Thing. It explores a Brooklyn neighborhood simmering racial tension between its African American resident and the Italian American owners of a local pizzeria, culminating in a tragedy and violence on a hot summer day. So, this is a very brief summary of the movie Do the Right Thing. Now, what this kind of done is to analyze this movie from the cultural studies scholars and try to understand how the movie has kind of helped us understand race and ethnic relations. So, there are multiple ideas which are evident if we kind of watch this movie, and the first idea is of a multiracial ghetto stereotype. So, the text mentions how male character in a ghetto setting use stereotypical and offensive terms for various ethnic groups like Black, Korean, Puerto Ricans, Jews and Italians. These insults exaggerate cultural and racial biases, reflecting real tension between different communities in the urban environment. The second idea which is portrayed in the Lee's world or Spike Lee's movie is racial ideologies on screen. So, the movie shows these racial and class insult in very direct, in your face way through close up shots and loud arguments. So, it is kind of naturalized. If some of the white kind of using abusive language or slang language, it is also portraying the power, the dominance of a more dominant group over a subordinate group. So, the language, the body language, the sound effect, everything kind of speaks of the power, and that is how it will also kind of show in movie that the minority groups, the say the blacks, are kind of fearful, they are submissive. So, it is reproducing the stereotypes around racial identity. So, it does not show how personal conflicts, but reveals deeper systematic issues of racism, violence and how different ethnic groups are isolated from one another. The third idea of race and relation in Lee's world is racial intolerance. The text highlights that the racism in the movie is not just about skin color, but it is linked to deeper social issues like class and religion. So, the way of life of the dominant class is accepted. So, it is not just kind of because you are kind of black, the treatment is being made. It is also a collective representation of inequality, and it is kind of maintaining the power relation, that if you are in the other side, on the lower side, your cultural life, your religion, your class identity is far different from those on the dominant side. So, racism is not really explored deeply in the movie, but it is showing that it exists. So, through the language, through the way the white speaks to the black, it is kind of giving us the evidence that there is the practice of racism. So, even though characters insult each other racially, the movie does not give much attention to broader institutional racism. So, the objective of the movie is not to kind of show the practice of racism. What is hidden behind is to use the racial inequality as a selling or marketing your movie. So, if you are kind of showing these abusive language or the power, then there is the understanding that is going to do better on the box office. It is going to kind of attract a larger audience, and that is how they are selling inequality. And that is how the neoliberal market economy is kind of structuring or leading to the persistence of various forms of inequality. The fourth race and ethnic relations in Spike Lee's movie is differences and stereotypes in the hood. In the neighborhood where the movie takes place, racial differences are obvious and people mock each other's background. This shows how separated different ethnic groups are in society. Though they may live close together, they remain socially and culturally distant, and the film portrays that tension. So, even if a kind of coexist in, say, the neighborhood, yet these boundaries are maintained. The imagination of the identity is there in the subconscious mind, and everyday interaction is based on your racial identity. So, the primary frame which is being used for everyday interaction is the racial identity. The fifth idea is racial rage and violence. So, where there is power, there has to be a kind of a violence. So, the movie Doing Thing Right reflects a kind of a rage that goes beyond race and class. It is about deeper frustration with a system that excludes people of color from society's benefit. This rage, often silent or muted, is a central theme in the film, and it challenges the viewers to think about how racism affects different groups. Blacks, Korean, Puerto Rican, etc. So, again the idea is that it is not that there is a kind of a uniform or a universal way in which the dominant group interacts with the subordinate. So, the experience of racial inequality or the experience of violence around racial identity would vary from community to community, and since it has kind of become so naturalized, those people who are kind of subject to this violence or the victims of violence are now gradually becoming conscious about it, and therefore there is a kind of a frustration that the things are not changing, or the exploitation or kind of denial of resources is now playing at a psychological level, where and that is what leads to violence. When this frustration or the agony becomes kind of beyond control, it leads to the racial violence. This rage, often silenced or muted, is central theme in the film, and it challenges the viewer to think about how racism are different. The text talks about how disadvantaged racial groups sometimes adopt a reverse form of ethnic superiority, where each group reinforces its identity. The seventh idea is end of racial model. The text concludes by saying that Spike Lee film marks the end of traditional ideas about how race relations in America should improve, like desegregation. So, the film suggests that instead of real progress, society is going backward, returning to the extreme racial tensions seen in the early 90s. So, the idea is that there is a racial inequality which has got aggravated with the neoliberal marketing and selling of product, and cinema is a product commoditized which is being sold, and therefore there is also the reference to go back to, say, a time when racism or racial inequality was strong, and advocate for a racial free society. So, holiday history of racial representations kind of begins with Chinese laundry scene, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and a Gypsy Duel. These are all cinema from the Hollywood, and they represent racist view of American race relation, often portraying people of color in negative stereotypes. So, when we kind of look into the conclusion, we try to understand that despite brief moments of increased sensitivity following major social movement, these portrayals largely continue to exotize, distort and stereotype Hollywood representation influenced by racist ideology, performance, tradition and societal segregation contributed to cultural legacy that reinforces negative perceptions of non-white race. Ultimately, this highlights how cinema not only reflected but actively shaped and perpetuated racial inequalities in American society. For reference, the entire lecture is based on the article by Denzing N.K. published in 2007, Selling Images of Inequality, Hollywood Cinema and the Reproduction of Racial Gender Stereotype, published in the Blackwood Companion to Social Inequality. If we read this, we will get a whole good idea of how Hollywood cinema perpetuates gender and racial inequality. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.